Prepare yourself for 13 of the most embarrassing tech fails of all time, from the keyboard with 113 OLED displays inside of it, to PlayStation's most expensive mistake ever in history, to literal global apocalypse. Starting with McDonald's, who, in one of the weirdest collabs of all time, went into partnership with IBM in 2021 to run a trial of an AI-assisted voice ordering system at about 100 of their drive-thrus. Guess what happened when TikTok got their hands on it? Giving orders to the wrong cars, multiplying items, and I'm not talking someone walking away with a single extra chicken nugget. People were leaving with hundreds of dollars worth of nuggets. And I think the most embarrassing, and yet at the same time also the most we probably should have seen this coming era, giving people ridiculous combinations of products that any human would realize make no sense at all. Like ice cream with ketchup and butter, or I really wish I was joking, ice cream with bacon on top. But hey, at least that means the McDonald's ice cream machine was actually working for once. All while having the audacity to correct the pronunciation of its customers.
And that says it's caramel.
Like, huh? So yeah, McDonald's basically had to end the trial ASAP, but we got some pretty good laughs out of it. A pretty harmless 1 out of 10 fail. The same can't be said for number 12 though. Because in 2005, an unknown Russian design company called Art Lebedev released a series of concept images for a revolutionary new type of keyboard. A keyboard called the Optimus Maximus, which, yeah, that's a pretty sick name, where each individual key has its own tiny display. And that's kind of amazing because it means every single key can be whatever you want it to be. So let's say I get a little bored of the normal QWERTY keyboard layout. Bam. And it's kind of mind-frying just the power that this gives you. Every single key can be a letter, a number, a direct shortcut to a Photoshop tool, or your ultimate move in League. It's kind of like the MacBook Touch Bar, but useful. You could change your whole keyboard's language with one press, and there's even a programmable side panel which could allow you to fast swap between applications. Now you might be thinking, in 2005? Surely that kind of miniaturized LCD display technology just wasn't there at the time. And you would be right. This was meant to be a concept, but people just got so excited by it that Lebedev decided this is our chance to do something big. We actually have to make this thing. They quickly realized that LCD displays at the time were too dim for what they wanted to do, so they decided to go with OLED, tech that wasn't really a big thing yet in 2005, especially in such a tiny form. Wow. Which means that as well as having to make this monster of a keyboard, they also ended up having to create their own proprietary miniature OLED display technology, just so they could fit one of them under each one of these transparent keys, which they did by working with a Taiwanese supplier called iDisplay. And somehow, after all of that, they actually managed to ship a working product in 2008. Sadly, they got too caught up in the hype themselves. This company became so obsessed with achieving this goal of 113 OLED displays that they forgot to actually make the typing experience good. These keys have such high resistance that you're just tired after like a minute of using it. Oh yeah, and the thing was priced at $1,500 when it launched. So only a very small fraction of the people who first expressed interest actually followed through and bought the thing. I'm only going to give this a 2 out of 10 fail though, because there was a silver lining. Remember iDisplay? Well, they put so much time and effort into helping to create this mini under keyboard OLED tech that they decided to run with it anyway. And they were eventually purchased by Elgato, which is what led to the Elgato Stream Deck, which even today is one of the must-have gadgets for any streamer.
But not every story has a happy ending. Some of them have a nappy ending. This is Paul and Rachel Barron, who, after being completely unable to find a washable swim nappy for their son that was actually good and actually fit, decided to make their own. They started a company called Bow & Bell Littles, selling them on Amazon, and very quickly hit $1 million in sales. These guys were killing it. They were appearing on shows, they were being profiled by Forbes. But 4 years ago, possibly the absolute worst thing that could have happened. Amazon, you know, the nearly $2 trillion technology company, sent one customer a used diaper. And you bet that customer left a review. The diaper arrived used and was covered in poop stains. Nothing could have been more disgusting. These were not small stains either. I was extremely grossed out. Now this sticky situation was nothing to do with the Barons. This happened because the person at Amazon responsible for checking returned products before sending them out to new customers did a pants job. But the worst part of this is, after the Barons saw this review and they scurried to tell Amazon that it wasn't their fault, that it could very heavily damage their business and to take it down, Amazon refused. And the barons were right. This one review did completely tank their business. 4 years later, they're now $600,000 in debt, including a loan that has their house up as collateral. It's only after Bloomberg published an article about the whole debacle that Amazon finally agreed to take the review down. But the damage was already done. So 4 out of 10 fail, made worse by the fact that it wasn't even these guys' fault. So if you ever find yourself in the market for a washable swim nappy, now you know where to go. Just maybe don't return it after you've used it.
Okay, we've seen all sorts of laptops over the years. Super high-end gaming laptops, super affordable $400 laptops. But what on earth does a $100 laptop look like? Well, in 2005, the founder of the MIT Media Lab, Nicholas Negroponte, formed One Laptop Per Child, a non-profit whose goal was to transform education in the developing world by creating and distributing as many devices as possible to children in schools. And the device that was going to change children's lives? The XO, a quirky little green plastic laptop designed to be produced as cheaply as possible while still giving disadvantaged kids access to a computer. And this thing had a lot of thoughtful features packed into it for its tiny cost, especially considering this was 2005. A hand crank that would allow children to power their device even if they didn't have access to an electrical outlet, which means that the device ran on a tiny fraction of the power of probably whatever you're watching this on, and that was crucial to allow kids to use it outside of school. The screen could flip around to turn it into an e-reader. The thing was made of shock-absorbing plastic and rubber, a feature that Negroponte clearly very much enjoyed showing off. A rubberized spill-proof keyboard, as well as all the ports being covered by the Wi-Fi antennae when closed, all with a logo in various colors so that kids could tell their laptops apart. And the absolute core of the whole thing was that the device ran on a Linux-based operating system, giving kids total access to the computer. The organization actually managed to gather so much steam that they were even offered free macOS licenses by Steve Jobs himself, which that never happens. But Negroponte turned them down just to keep the system as open as possible. All this for only $100. And they didn't even want to stop there. We really believe that we can make literally hundreds of millions of these machines available to children around the world, Negroponte promised. And it's not just $100, it's going to go lower. If you're thinking this is all too good to be true, good instincts. And people started to pick up on this when the crank broke off at the live demo. Not a great start. And by the time the laptop actually came out, a lot of these promises had just mysteriously vanished. There was no crank, although I guess you can kind of see why. It wasn't as durable as promised, the SSD only had 1 GB of storage, the screen was terrible, and the worst part of it was this whole project was geared around this being the $100 laptop. But even with all of these quality cuts, they only managed to get the launch price down to $130, which then went up to $180 in the next revision. So by the end of this, all the critics were convinced that the money that had been put into this project would have been far better spent on things that people in developing nations actually want and need, like, you know, better schools and clean drinking water. 4 out of 10 fail. Now, do you remember this little guy? This, alongside the Humane AI pin, were literally supposed to be the next step in the evolution of personal tech, after the smartphone, thanks to something called the Large Action Model, an AI system that can not just talk to you, but also perform actions based on what you say. Like, for example, communicate completely on your behalf with flights and hotels to book your entire holiday from just you saying a couple of words, which excited enough people to make $10 million in the first 5 days alone. But spoiler alert, no one would ever trust it to do that, because the Rabbit R1 sucks. The battery sucks, it requires its own SIM card if you want to use it on the go, and this thing suffered from some major security vulnerabilities from launch that Rabbit basically ignored. But the most fundamental, it wasn't needed. Everything this thing does can already be done completely on your smartphone, as well as a whole load of things that this can't, which led a lot of people to ask the question, sure, the teenage engineering design device housing does look really cool, but shouldn't this just be an app? Well, turns out it actually is. Android authorities Michel Rahman managed to download Rabbit's launcher APK onto a Google Pixel 6a and got it to run the entire R1 experience, which really does make this device the final boss of this meeting could have been an email. And in a similar vein of companies biting off more than they could chew, oh my god, You know Hewlett-Packard, or HP? If so, in all likelihood it's because you've used one of their PCs in your school computer room or the library, because they're affordable and they do the job. They're not exactly the company you think of as the front runners of consumer technology. However, in 2011, 1 year after the release of the iPad, HP decided it was their time to shine. They wanted to take on Apple with the HP Touchpad. And HP weren't stupid enough to just try and beat Apple at their own game. They promised something different. Because their tablet used the WebOS operating system, built on the same tech as a lot of web browsers, the touchpad promised to be a more open and customizable experience than Apple's walled garden approach, while also maintaining some of the style and flair that Apple's known for, which I think is fair to say was lacking in most Android devices at the time. And because WebOS was based on common web technology, it was supposed to be super developer-friendly too. Now this was a very expensive move, because HP had to acquire Palm, who made WebOS for, close your eyes, $1.2 billion. So I'm sure everyone at the company was just praying that this would pay off. Oh god, there is absolutely no competition between how slick and intuitive the iPad interface is versus this. The touchpad was pretty universally recognized as a much slower, much clunkier, and significantly bulkier iPad. Nobody wanted this thing. And do you know what makes it particularly embarrassing? The HP was already worse than the original iPad, with it being so buggy on top of everything else. But to finish it all off, by the time this touchpad had actually come out, Apple had just launched this, the iPad 2, which absolutely decimated the thing. This product was performing so poorly, both in terms of sales and customer experience, even after slashing the price by $100, that HP literally took it off the market after only 48 days. They even had to refund retailers for the stock they'd purchased, practically soiling everyone's perception of the whole company, while burning through a hell of a lot of cash while they were at it. 5 out of 10. Now, for number 7, we actually have to go all the way back to 1988, before the World Wide Web, if you can even imagine such a thing. We're talking about a time where only 60,000 computers across fewer than 20 countries were connected to the internet, which was only used by universities, research centers, and government bodies. But then in November that year, a malicious self-replicating worm program was released from a computer at MIT, and 24 hours later, 6,000 of those 60,000 computers had been infected. And let's be very clear, computers in very important places, including major universities like Berkeley and Harvard, and even NASA. The worm used a backdoor in the email systems to get into these computers, which wasn't very hard. Computers at this stage, they were not ready for internet trolls. And while it didn't destroy any files, it rendered those systems practically unusable. Emails were delayed for days, and functions at vital institutions, including, by the way, the military, were blocked, leading to all sorts of key infrastructure having to either wipe their systems or take them offline for over a week in an attempt to rid themselves of the worm. We are talking up to millions of dollars of damage, with obviously the potential for much bigger consequences. Here's where it gets really interesting. Seeing the damage it had caused, an anonymous programmer admitted to 2 friends that he was the one who'd created the worm, but that he hadn't intended it to spiral this much out of control. He asked one of the friends to send an anonymous message across the internet, which included both his apologies and instructions on how to remove the worm, but ironically, few people actually saw this because of the extent of the network damage. The other friend went to the New York Times to try and do some damage control, telling them that the worm was meant to be a harmless experiment, but accidentally revealed the programmer's identity by, well, it wasn't very smart, using his initials, which were easily searchable at his university. So, the New York Times found and outed the culprit, 23-year-old Robert Tappan Morris. And then the FBI got involved. They quickly launched an investigation and found plenty of incriminating evidence, which was used to prosecute him in 1989. And the reason this was so momentous is that Morris was the first person to ever be indicted under US Congress's new 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Silver lining though, this was the wake-up call for global cybersecurity. Only a few days after this attack, the US Department of Defense set up America's first computer emergency response team in Pittsburgh. And now that they've woken up, here is how Bitdefender's new Scam Copilot, our sponsor, can help you to avoid the same embarrassment. So, this right here is a scam website. They steal your data, they take your money, and you don't get the products you've paid for. But equally, how on earth would you know? This is how. So my phone has the Bitdefender Scam Copilot baked into it, which means that when I try and load up that same page, it will stop me. Dangerous page blocked for your protection. And it's not just for your browser, this thing protects everything. Like for example, Bitdefender now pre-checks every single email and text as they come in for scams and phishing attempts before I even need to think about clicking them. And there is a lot more, including a live chat that lets you check just about anything else that might look a little dodgy that you're concerned about interacting with. Link below to get yourself the Bitdefender Scam Copilot.
Now, at least the Morris worm issues were resolved in the end, though. The Tesla Cybertruck, on the other hand, has just been one continuous rocky road of problems. Ever since its very inception, where the bulletproof windows smashed during a demo to show how bulletproof they were. But who would have thought that that wouldn't even be its biggest issue? Because now the thing's actually out, this thing has been recalled 5 times just this year. January for a warning light font size that was too small. Not something I ever considered before, but absolutely a real danger. Thankfully, they managed to fix this one remotely with an update. April for a dodgy accelerator pedal, which could dislodge from its pad if pushed too hard, getting stuck on the throttle, which if you think about it is as bad as an issue can get on a car. In June, Tesla had to issue 2 recalls on the same day because of faulty windshield wipers. I mean, who would have guessed that the Cybertruck's bizarre single 4-foot-long wiper might not work perfectly? It was failing due to excessive electrical current, requiring the entire motor to be replaced. And then one for the sail applique, the long strip of plastic lining on top of the sides of the bed, which was poorly installed on some vehicles, and has fallen off in at least 2 cases, creating a road hazard that very much has the potential to be deadly. And then finally, in October, due to a software issue that delays or prevents the rear view camera from showing you its feed. The result? Over 27,000 Cybertrucks have been recalled. That's basically every Cybertruck ever made. And as of July the 8th,
Tesla has also been offering free motor replacements.
they said it's not dangerous to drive with the old one, and they haven't officially called this a recall, but given that so far the Cybertruck has given people all the confidence of a wet paper bag with wheels on it, I don't know how many people are going to believe that. This smells like a 6 out of 10 fail to me.
And now we're in the top 5. Now it just goes from bad to worse. Have you heard of Concord? I'm gonna guess you haven't, and that's part of the problem. See, Concord is a video game that should have gone gangbusters. It was a hero shooter, one of the most popular genres in gaming history. It was developed by ex-Bungie staff, you know, the people who worked on the very successful Destiny 2. And it was a PlayStation Studios game, meaning that it's published by PlayStation themselves. And refreshingly, it was going to be a one-time $40 purchase with no battle pass or microtransactions. So what could go wrong? Well, as soon as the first trailer dropped, people immediately lost interest. And that includes me. I was watching the PlayStation event live when they announced this, like,
What did I just see?
sure, we love a good hero shooter, but ever since Overwatch exploded onto the scene in 2016, the entire industry has just been pumping out clones of that game that basically do nothing new. So we're at a stage now in 2024 where people are very fatigued of the genre. But that's far from the full deal, because the character designs were boring and also particularly aesthetically unappealing, which sounds silly, but a genre like this actually needs players to want to look like the heroes they're playing as, especially since this entire genre revolves around unlockable skins that you want to be desirable to keep players playing. The 70s sci-fi aesthetic just wasn't resonating with kids who were born 30 years later, let alone the fact that it just made the entire world look like a knockoff Guardians of the Galaxy without the charm. And arguably the biggest problem, Sony really failed to market the game at all. Like, this first trailer was 3 months before the release of the game, which is probably why you've never heard of it. Even so, I don't think anyone expected just how badly this game would perform. Concord launched in August 2024, and want to guess how many concurrent players that it had at its absolute peak on Steam? To give you an idea, Counter-Strike 2 has nearly 2 million players. Concord? 697. And you know what makes it many times worse? Concord's been in development for 8 years. And you might be thinking, well, surely that means the game's going to be good. And according to reviews, it actually was at least fun to play. But what happened 8 years ago? Overwatch. This thing is so clearly yet another copycat trying to cash in on the genre, except unlike games like Paladins or Valorant, which have their own twists, this game took so long to make that it's both completely missed the hero shooter hype window, while being based on the Gen 1 product that in itself is now outdated. I mean, Overwatch 2 is already out now, and even that is struggling. But the single most embarrassing part of this misadventure is that Sony saw Concord's paltry player numbers and decided that instead of giving this game a chance, trying something new with the marketing, like, I don't know, just off the top of my head, telling people the game existed, that they would shut the servers down forever after 2 weeks of them being live. They invested a rumored $400 million into developing this thing, which would make Concord easily PlayStation's most expensive game ever. Even The Last of Us Part 2 only cost them $220 million, although there are other rumors saying that this was closer to $150 million. But either way, surely it was worth just risking a little bit extra just in case they could scrape some of that back. Easy 6 out of 10 disaster here. That didn't sound good. And now you can just get ready to lose all trust entirely in the ability of big companies to actually look after you, starting with the Snowflake hack. So, Snowflake is a high-security cloud storage provider with over 9,800 corporate customers, including giants like Santander, Ticketmaster, and AT&T. So all of these massive companies will store their customers' private data using Snowflake. And all three of those companies were affected when a hacking group compromised Snowflake in April. The hacker group, who call themselves the Shiny Hunters, which is another name for people who spend hundreds of hours in the Pokemon games searching for rare shiny versions of them, got straight into the company's Snowflake accounts, stole the data in them with the intention to sell that data off. They used info-stealing malware programs to infect systems not owned by Snowflake themselves, but likely devices owned by Snowflake's customers, companies like AT&T, who would often save their Snowflake login credentials on their own devices too. And honestly, this hack sounds like it was a whole lot easier to pull off than actually finding a shiny Pokemon. People need to remember that storing your data in a locked down server is fantastic, but it doesn't mean anything if the passwords to access that server are literally sitting on your desktop. Your security is only as good as the weakest link in your chain. And yet these fruitcakes didn't even enable two-factor authentication on their machines. And the impact has been bad. The hackers got away with 1.3 terabytes of personal info from 560 million Ticketmaster accounts, including full names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, even payment card data, which they are selling for $500,000 on Breach Forums, a notorious cybercrime platform that they own. AT&T was hit even harder with info from, I quote, nearly all of their tens of millions of customers stolen, including which numbers those customers interacted with, counts of the texts and calls, and total call durations for specific days or months, the info from which absolutely can and very likely will be used to scam them, with tools on the internet also allowing you to find the names connected to those numbers. And this is the funniest part. AT&T has reportedly paid the group Shiny Hunters $370,000 to delete the data, the only proof of which comes from a video of the Shiny Hunters clicking the delete button, as if they aren't a criminal organization who hasn't already made a backup. I'm cringing just thinking about it. 7 out of 10 fail. So there's been a bunch of cyber attacks in this series, but when your network is down because of a hacker, you can at least blame it on them, even if it exploited a vulnerability that you should have fixed. However, you know what's a lot more embarrassing? Is when you brick your own tech, let alone basically everyone else's. Do you remember in July when it felt like the entire world had a sudden IT crisis? Well, that's because of CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity company who makes products to protect Windows. And get this, over half of Fortune 500 companies rely on them. This is not a small potatoes company. However, on July 18th, CrowdStrike pushed a minor update for one of their products called Falcon, which is a cloud-based AI-powered malware protection platform, and it wreaked absolute havoc, sentencing some 8.5 million PCs around the world to the infamous blue screen of death. I'm talking banks, TV stations, airlines were down. Like, Delta alone had to cancel around 7,000 flights, basically everyone who used Falcon. Hospitals were canceling non-urgent surgeries, and even when stuff was running, it was often because people had resorted to doing things by hand, like this handwritten boarding pass for a flight in India. In certain parts of the US, even the emergency 911 number was down. And it's all because Falcon's little update, which happened all the time to keep up with new malware threats as the company learns about them, installed code onto people's Windows computers containing a logic error, which caused their devices to crash since they couldn't compute the impossible logic. And because the issue is happening on what's called the kernel level, i.e. accessing and editing the entire underlying system, not just the surface level stuff normal apps have access to, and because it was also a bootstrap driver, meaning it was required for the system to boot up at all, it was like the perfect cocktail to lock those PCs into an endless recovery loop. Fortunately, the fix turned out to be pretty simple. Just boot it into safe mode and delete the files associated with the problem. But because of how embedded it had become, in a lot of cases it required an IT professional to have physical access to the machine, meaning that recovery was slow for many organizations, with the disruptions causing a total of not millions, not tens of millions, but $5.4 billion in direct losses for companies. Ooh. But this one is straight up bonkers. So Marina 1 was the US's first interplanetary space probe. It was designed to journey to Venus, equipped with various scientific instruments to allow it to record data. Spoiler alert, it didn't get there, and you're not going to believe how embarrassing the reason is. The thing was supposed to fly past Venus and use these sensors to collect data about the planet, keeping in contact with mission control for about 15 weeks total. But after all of the work that was put into designing and constructing the craft, which was composed of over 54,000 components, disaster struck. It successfully lifted off on July 22nd, 1962, flying nearly 100 miles upwards for 3.5 minutes until suddenly, randomly, it veered off course. So much so that they had to issue the self-destruct command to avoid a collision with ships in the North Atlantic. The reason it happened though? The hardware was absolutely fine. The culprit was an unbelievably easy to miss software error. A standard R was used in one equation when it should have been an R with an overbar. And the reason that's so important is that the guidance computer on board that's making sure the thing is on track is constantly checking in with its sensors. And the bar on top of the R is the symbol that makes sure it takes the average of those sensors instead of just taking one reading at face value. So without the correct R, the probe basically started to overcorrect its course in response to outlying data points that it should have been ignoring. The project cost them around $192 million in today's money, all thrown out the window because of a single typo. I mean, what's the most damage a typo has ever caused you? Could actually be pretty bad now I think about it. 8 out of 10 fail. The only slight saving grace being that they'd also already constructed Mariner 2, an identical probe, and because the fatal problem was a completely avoidable human error, they fixed it in about 4 seconds, and Mariner 2 was launched successfully just a month later, and was the reason that we now know Venus rotates in the opposite direction to Earth. But nothing beats the Y2K bug. Whoa. If you were born after 2000, this one's probably going to sound too insane to be true. Do you remember when everyone thought the world was going to end in 2012? Because that was the end of a 5,000-year cycle in the ancient Mayan calendar. Well, there was something just like that for the year 2000, only this one was grounded in the much more real fear of a tech apocalypse. Because it turns out that when complex computer systems were originally designed in the 60s, computer scientists figured that they'd save what pitiful storage and screen space that they had by using a 2-digit number for the year. We were very much in the 1900s after all. Years beginning with 18 were old news and 20 felt like too far away. The problem is, as the years ticked up and we got ever closer to the new millennium, people started to wonder, are computers actually going to understand that 00 means 2000, not 1900? And you might think that the only real consequence of that would be waking up on New Year's morning thinking, hey, that's funny, the clock's just gone back 100 years. There were real reasons to be worried, because as you've seen with the Mariner, small miscalculations with the input of a computer can have major consequences with the output. And in this case, industries that relied on computer-tracked dates could be affected in huge ways, like banks, which track interest daily, could potentially suddenly calculate interest at minus 99 years. And places like power plants, which track routine safety checks of things like radiation levels, could pose a threat to human life if these checks were missed. People even started panicking that planes might start falling from the sky and that people's pacemakers would just stop, that old Uncle Joe would just collapse and die the second that you go from 1 to Happy New Year at your party. So, governments raced to avert a potential computer crisis, rushing to update anything and everything to a 4-digit date. And I mean everything. I don't think anyone quite expected just how much would be spent on this. You know how some companies in this fails list have lost hundreds of millions? Here, an estimated $200 to $600 billion was spent to tackle the issue. And that's in the 1990s. And when you think about it, that is a catastrophic amount of money to burn, considering that it could have been avoided by a few computer scientists typing 2 more characters. 9 out of 10. Thankfully, the steps taken did avert widespread chaos, but the few issues that did still occur proved that the worry was warranted. For example, on January 1st, 2000, many computers did think they woke up in 1900, forcing 15 nuclear reactors across the world to shut down. Some people who did, in fact, incur 100-year bank loan interests, and hilariously, one customer at a New York video rental store who was handed a bill of $91,250. Yes, for having rented a movie for 100 years. Catch you in the next fails video, right here.